All right. Hey everyone, I'm Chad,
I'm Khalil.
and we are the Marshals of Truth. So to start off our second episode on on the question of were the atomic bombs justified, we could start out by just recapping how our last episode went. So we started by giving a sort of context of what was going on around the time of the atomic bombings of Japan. And so we briefly outlined some of the major battles, such as the Battle of Okinawa. We introduced the Manhattan Project, the atomic bombs themselves. But one of the biggest things that we talked about was Operation Downfall. And Operation Downfall was the American and greater Allied planned invasion of Japan, which was to start on November 1st of 1945 and would involve just about more than 6 million Allied troops going against 4 million trained Japanese soldiers and potentially up to 30 million potentially conscripted Japanese civilians who would be fighting for their homeland. And so we detailed how this would have been a very devastating invasion. There would have been a lot of difficulties, both geographically and also in combat with this operation. And if you'd like to know more, you could go and look back at our first part of the series, but it's very likely that we're going to keep talking about it in this episode. So, another thing that we kind of ended on was introducing the arguments that we still have today on whether or not the bomb was justified, because at the end of the day, that's kind of the topic of our series. So, on the side against the atomic bomb and the people who say that the atomic bomb was unnecessary, they say that given the humanitarian consequences of the atomic bomb, that it was wrong. 230,000 people died, and they were um, long-lasting effects due to radiation and things of that sort. That it was, the wrong choice. Another argument that is brought up is that the Japanese would have just surrendered given time. That given the environment, that the upper class would have realized that there wasn't a chance and that he just would have given up had the US just kept going or just kept up whatever efforts they had. And then another argument was saying that the Soviet Union and not the atomic bomb was the main reason that Japan surrendered, and that the start of their invasion of Manchuria, which is northern China, basically around Korea, that invasion was one of the biggest reasons for Japan surrendering. So that's some of the points that that side of the argument would put forward. On the other side, arguing that the atomic bomb was justified, which I can admit is kind of the side that we'll be presenting a lot of today, is saying that the use of the atomic bombs, um, it prevented Operation Downfall, which we detailed, which would have been honestly a tragedy of an operation, and that millions of would have died, and so that the use of the bombs led to the surrender of the Japanese government and the prevention of this terrible operation. And also, another reason for the use of the bombs is that Japan would not have surrendered given time, and that they would not have surrendered if Operation Downfall was to occur, just given how previous battles in the Pacific Theater went. And so, with that, we're going to kind of get started with some of the arguments that we're going to be making in this video. So, one of the big arguments that is made now on why the bombs should not have been dropped, why it was unjustified, is that Japan was going to surrender anyways. That in 1945, in August, had the US not dropped the bombs, just given a couple weeks or given some months, Japan would have just surrendered. The elite would have realized that the war was unwinnable and they did not want to face any sort of invasion, so they just would have given up. And I believe Khalil can kind of start on it talking about that and offering, our sort of rebuttal to that argument.
Right. We have we have quite a few really good sources for this argument. To start from the Atomic Archive, quoting the Atomic Archive on an article on this very topic about the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Quote. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, founder of the kamikazes, argued that the Japanese would never be defeated if we were prepared to sacrifice 20 million Japanese lives in a special attack effort. He later committed suicide rather than surrender. All right. So that right there tells you that you heard like Vice Admiral, so this guy's part of the Navy, this guy's part of the military hawks that were very very hard lined about continuing the war against the Allies, especially the Americans. Um, and since this guy was the founder of the kamikazes, you can see that this guy was very hardened to the belief that you should never surrender. Um, just like throwing away lives, not giving the pilots any chance of survival, not giving them enough fuel to fly back, just sending them to go straight into a ship. So this is that guy, and he said that 20 million Japanese lives should be prepared to be sacrificed. That at the time of 1945 was a quarter of the entire Japanese population. That includes babies, mothers, young children, elderly, the sick. So um, this is essentially what should be considered national suicide. But in the end of the day, that suicide came from him. So that just gives us an idea of the sort of fighting spirit that the Americans were so worried about, and rightfully so.
Yeah.
The next comes from the National World War II Museum, which has an amazing article that we continuously quoted. We're just going to like lay onto you every quote that we found to be truly awesome for this argument, because there's so much that they mentioned that we didn't even think about, that they just outright like um, mentioned that that really strengthens this argument. First is, quote, given the incredible history of defiance of government authority by Japan's armed forces for at least the 15 years prior to 1945, not only American but also Japanese leaders, including the emperor, understood that a surrender order by the government, even one from the emperor, might not secure compliance by the armed forces, end quote. So um, there was an understanding that that would not be enough. One thing to also keep in mind about that point being made is that what is it here? The title of emperor has never been too powerful in Japanese society. Um, During the Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period, where we hear a lot more about samurais and where that myth of the samurai, um, of the stories of the samurai were around, which was like 400 or 500 years ago, until the 1860s. The position of emperor was really a figurehead title. They had no real power. And the daimyo, the secondary position under the emperor in the medieval society of Japan, had more power. They were really the rulers of the country. So the deification of the emperor, which occurred during the 20s and 30s, um, and and to a limited extent since the 1860s when Japan, um, 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 when the imperial government was established. Um, During the 20s and 30s, the deification of the emperor was really manufactured by the military to exercise power over the civilian population. So, next quote that we want to refer to from this source, because there's so many good things there, is that quote, the emperor and other key members of the inner leadership experienced truly terrifying anxiety that the Japanese people were nearing a revolutionary moment. The domestic situation became the euphemism these elite leaders employed to mask their real fear. They projected the real crisis would come in the fall of 1945, particularly when the rice crop was due, end quote. So, um, on top of that, they weren't just worried about like the moderate folks within the leadership of Japan, because there were there like certain people within the Japanese government that were not necessarily representing the military itself, but more civilian government. Um, they saw the people that they were ruling over through the neighborhood associations, the Tonarigumi, that we forgot to mention in the first episode, which ruled over civilian life and was actually those who reported on civilian morale and reported disloyalty to the secret police.
Mhm.
They were also the same group that brought families every once in a while, every so rarely, in the months leading up to the bombs being dropped, to public trainings where the toddlers would be trained to throw grenades and teenage boys to strap explosives to their chests and run in their tanks, as we mentioned again in the last episode. It was the Tonarigumi that would do that. And through that service and through the civilian government, there grew an increasingly worrying domestic situation in where a revolution seemed somewhat likely.
Yeah. Can I jump in there?
Yeah.
So, what we're outlining here is that what we had in the Japanese government, not just in August of 1945, but even after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was a divided government. We had people who were on the hardlining side, which were the army, the navy, just as we mentioned, the vice admiral, who wanted to continue the fight. They did not want to give up. They did not want to surrender. They did not want to give in any peace agreements or anything like that because they believed that the Japanese people and that Japan would survive, or that they should be willing to give themselves up for this kind of final fight. And so, with that side, with the military side, there was also the kind of moderate side that Camille was just mentioning. The people who are more concerned about the people who may be wanting an end to this war, whose situation is getting worse and worse, who might even rebel against the government if they continue to fight. But as we kind of detailed before, the army and the kind of military forces have always been on the most powerful side of Japanese government. Just as we detailed, the emperor was kind of a figurehead so that the army and the military could kind of be ruling the country. And so we didn't always have a clear sense that Japan was willing to just surrender even after the atomic bombings. And it would become to find out that one side would prevail. But we had the army very much willing to continue the fight in spite of all this kind of hardship, um, as well as this kind of opposing side. So yeah, that's one of the points. But Khalil, I'll let you continue.
Right. And to expand on that, quoting National World War II Museum, quote, Tokyo received news of a devastating but mysterious event in Hiroshima on August 6th, but only the next day learned President Truman maintained it was an atomic bomb. The reaction by Japanese armed forces to Truman's claim is extremely important. The Imperial Army declared they would only succeed if it was an atomic bomb after an investigation, but the stance of the Imperial Navy was much more ominous. Top naval leaders allowed that the Americans might have used an atomic bomb, but even so, they could not possess more atomic bombs, or if they did, they would not be that powerful. Given this reason, it's obvious that a one bomb demonstration never would have convinced the Japanese leaders to capitulate. So, end quote. Um, the um, it's becoming quite clear if you're listening to this and you're hearing all these quotes that the bombs may actually have been what the Japanese leadership needed. As I mentioned in the last episode, sometimes to punish those in power, you need to punish the people because if the Allies, especially America, were at war with Japan, those that are making decisions in Japan are the military leaders. They're the ones that are leading the troops. So those are the ones you have to make a negotiation with. And if those are the same very people that wouldn't even concede if it was an atomic bomb, as if it really mattered whether or not it was an atomic bomb when an entire city is blown off the fucking map, you know, um, that it's becoming very worrying to American leaders like Truman, if Japan would ever surrender. Even after dropping the bomb that so many in the Allied leadership and even today are thinking is an unethical thing. The leaders of Japan, those that the Allies really needed to convince to stop fighting, did not want to stop fighting. Um, and they like, as you can see from what I quoted, that Tokyo's military officials in the Navy at the very least said that, oh, they only have one. It's not like they could possess more of these atomic bombs. Oh, 70, 80,000 people might have died, maybe 100,000 people might have died in the first day after this terrible atomic bomb has been dropped. It's such a technological marvel that they couldn't have another one. We've burdened the worst, okay, the worst of it all, you
They thought
know?
it was a bluff. It's
Exactly.
just a one-off.
Yeah. And afterwards, as Truman was trying to address the American people and show to the people of the world, especially Japan, that they should pressure their leaders to surrender and pressure themselves, Truman, that Hirohito and other military leaders should surrender. He said, if they do not now accept our terms, in the terms being the Potsdam Declaration, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. End quote. So that's quite a threat there, quite a threat. This is after the bomb on Hiroshima had been dropped. So anyone that's receiving reports in Tokyo about what had happened in Hiroshima, they know what is coming again. They
Hmm.
know what's coming. That
It will be
oh
this
that
again.
yeah, that city that got wiped off the map. Oh yeah, that was us, and we're gonna do it again.
Hmm. Yeah, there wasn't, to the obvious observer, there was no confusion over that this was going to happen again. In the fact that a major power in the Japanese government, the military, would not even come to the fact to just accept that. An obvious reality, they could not even come to accept that. That's the basic level of what they would need to even consider, surrendering or anything like that. And they wouldn't even consider that. So if we have that kind of power in government which doesn't even consider surrendering, that can't even accept that what just happened, how could we trust that that government would just over time surrender? And especially if these bombs hadn't even been dropped, if that a powerful force in the government was so willingly to be fine with the losing of hundreds of thousands of civilians in single strikes. And this isn't even mentioning the conventional bombings that had gone on in Japan over the past 3 years, and sometimes even months before the atomic bombings. To see a government that is so willing and so not caring for those civilians that they were able to just brush off an atomic bomb to that kind of level, there's what how could we expect that they would have just surrendered at all, especially if these bombs hadn't even been dropped? If they care so little for their people at the time, how can you trust that they would have come to some magical realization that it was over? If there was no Because there was something, of course, it was fundamentally different that it was an atomic bomb. How could we trust that that government would just surrender um, without the dropping of these weapons?
Right. So we'd already established by this point, and I believe our notes continue to expand on this point, but that the Japanese military government, which led the country at the time, um, would that they needed a wake up call. We'd already made that point, but there's an additional point on top of that. Just thinking, it like if the bombs are justified in the sense that they ended the war, we have to confirm if it were the bombs in itself that led to the war ending, that led to the Japanese finally deciding that they needed to surrender. And to do that, we need to look at more additional quotes. Um, Again, going to the National World War II Museum, quote, the Imperial Conference convened just before midnight, August the 9th through 10th. Joining the Big Six, those that are making the decisions, three on the civilian government and three on the military government. Joining the Big Six was Baron Kiichiro Hiranuma, president of the Privy Council. The divided Big Six and Hiranuma spoke. Notably, Army Chief of Staff Umezu characterized Soviet entry as unfavorable, but instead it did not invalidate Ketsugo. Hiranuma spoke pointedly of the deterioration of the domestic situation, particularly food supplies, end quote. So this Big Six Imperial Conference on the 9th to 10th, it was delayed by a few days um, since the civilian government officials suggested that such a conference be convened on the 6th after the first bomb was dropped. Um, but they delayed it 3 days after because the military representatives did not even want to speak about it. They didn't even want to hear the the talk of surrender at the very
The
least.
mentioning of it.
Right. So when when we hear that Soviet entry was unfavorable, but that it did not invalidate Ketsugo, which was the defensive operation in which they would defend Japan to the very last man, to the very last woman, to the very last child. Um, that turned out to be that the Soviet entry was not enough to end the war.
Hmm.
Like we look at all the different aspects that might have led to the war ending, and it certainly was not the Soviet entry.
Yeah, and just to but in there, as we said, one of the biggest arguments, especially now in a popular theory on why the Japanese surrendered, one of the biggest ones that is bringing up that's very popular now is that the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, which is northern China and around the Korean Peninsula, was the biggest factor which led to Japan's surrender in not in as opposed to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's one of the most popular theories. But as we see us through some of the quotes of the top officials in the Japanese government and even the army officials who were on the front lines who had to face this invasion, that they saw that it was not enough to invalidate their ideas and their plans for defending the homeland. It was not enough to make them just magically want to give up arms in surrender. Like this wasn't the one thing that got Japan to kind of lay down their arms. And I'll let you go a little more, which I do have some stuff to add to it, but you had something else as well, I believe.
Right. Um, the invasion of Manchuria, which was suggested by Truman, um, as early as April of 1945, um, had been had been in the planning for the weeks and months after Truman's suggestion, and was moving very quickly in its preparations, especially after the surrender of Hitler in May 1945. The that invasion of Manchuria was supposed to be the means of which Stalin would expand his influence, Soviet influence into East Asia. He wanted to have a part to play in the peace negotiations against Japan once the war had finally ended. If the war would have been ended by August 6th, after the first bomb was dropped, then Stalin and the Soviet Union would have been non-combatants and would have nothing to say in such a peace negotiation. But the invasion, which was planned for the end of August near the 15th, 20th, 25th, as soon as Stalin got news about the first bomb being dropped on Hiroshima, he moved that attack date up from what was supposed to be 2, 3 weeks down the line to within 48 hours. And he agreed with Roosevelt back when he was still alive before April 1945. He had made the agreement that he would declare war on Japan within 3 months of the German surrender. And the German surrender to the Soviet Union was the 9th of May in Moscow time. And so at 1 a.m., the earliest possible time, Stalin declared war on Japan and moved his troops across the border. And within about a week or two, the Soviets completely outclassed the Kwantung Army of the Japanese the Imperial Japanese Army at the time, um, and the landmass of northern China, Manchuria, was largely enveloped, which, just to keep in mind, Manchuria is the size of roughly Alaska, of the American state of Alaska. And so it's no small territory, and it was taken over by the Soviets within about 2 weeks. But there was a worry for Stalin that if he did not move his troops in time and moved along the original attack plan, that all his dreams of Soviet Asian influence would be under threat of disintegration.
Yep. Thank you for the kind of briefing on that. So, before this, Khalil mentioned the quote, as we go back to, so that Army Chief of Staff Umezu characterized the Soviet entry as unfavorable. So, of course, to be objective, yeah, the invasion of the Russians into Japan, into Japanese territory, of course, was unfavorable. It's not something that the Japanese really would have won. But in spite of that, as in reference to the article, instead it did not invalidate Ketsugo, the defense of the Japanese mainland. So, in spite of this invasion that the Soviet Union was encouraging into the Japanese Empire, top leaders in Japan, they still felt that they could still go ahead with the defense of the mainland. They didn't think of this as the one single reason that they had to lay down arms, and especially the army, who believed that they could still fight this and they could still win it out. While, to quote the Army Chief of Staff, while it was unfavorable, it was not, the nail in the coffin. It was not the thing that got these army chiefs to realize that it was unwinnable, and ultimately, it was not the reason that the Japanese government decided to surrender. Um, a quote. So, according to research done by Penn State professor James Maddox, it was in his book Hiroshima and History: The Myths of Revisionism, and we'll have this in a source document, which we'll have in a description in this video and the one prior. Um, so, according to that research, Koichi Kaido, the closest advisor to Emperor Hirohito, stated that we in the peace party, so the people in government who are wanting a reason to kind of reach out for peace, were greatly assisted by the atomic bomb in our endeavor to end the war. So this kind of emphasizes that those who were looking for a reason out of the war saw the atomic bomb and not the invasion of the Soviet Union as the best reason for the Japanese government to be looking for a reason to surrender, and that just like the army chief said, while the invasion of this Japan, of course, was bad, they saw the atomic bomb as one of, if not the biggest reasons to kind of go forward with this surrender. And additionally, um, a quote that I found in an article by the New York Times called "Blood in Our Hands," which came out in 2003. It'll be in the source document. The chief cabinet secretary, um, Hisatun Sakomizu, said that the bombing was a golden opportunity given by heaven for Japan to end the war. So the atomic bomb, not the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, was the big reason that Japan could look to end the war. It was the big reason that the people in government can attach to and to end the war. Because there's something, of course, fundamentally different with the atomic bombings of Japan than there was by the, say, continued conventional bombings of cities like Tokyo or other industrial cities, or even the fire bombings of those, or just a conventional war in general. An atomic bombing, it's not 50 bombers, 100 bombers, 150 going into the city and dropping thousands of bombs and decimating thousands of buildings. It can be a single bomber, one single bomber going into the city and dropping one single bomb and killing tens of thousands of people in one strike. Just imagine if that had gone on throughout the country. And I'm sure the Japanese leaders imagined this. Fleets of American bombers, one by one, going to Japan's biggest cities and dropping their one bomb to wipe those cities off the map. That's not something you would get in a conventional war. Like when you get these 100 bomber bombing raids, you would get thousands of houses, you would kill thousands of people, but that's much more different than a single bomber with one bomb completely, like if not almost completely, then completely destroying a city. And just imagine if there were two bombers with two bombs. That could wipe out hundreds of thousands of people. And just imagine if that could go on all across the country. And like I said, I'm sure the Japanese leaders were considering this. And so by the time Japan and the leaders actually, well, mainly Hirohito himself, actually admitted that Japan's best option was to surrender, we saw in Hirohito's speech with, which Khalil, could you bring up with the slides, the abbreviated one? We
Yeah, no,
saw in Hirohito's speech, he said he kind of emphasized that the nuclear bomb, it's closer to the end. He emphasized that the nuclear bomb was one of the most important things that led to his kind of decision to surrender. So to kind of read it off. Moreover, the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to damage is, indeed, incalculable, taking the toll of many innocent lives. Should we continue to fight, not only would it result in an ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but also it would lead to the total extinction of human civilization. He would later go on a couple sentences later to say, "This is the reason why we have ordered the acceptance of the provisions of the Joint Declaration of Powers." And we have the full speech later on in the presentation and also in the research document, but it leads clearly to that end. Yeah, it's very long. But Hirohito, in that speech, in the speech to the Japanese people, and in his private writings, said that the atomic bomb was one of the deciding factors in the decision to surrender because of just how different it was. It's not a normal bomb. It could wipe cities off the map, and if you spread it around, it could end the world. It could end, as he said, it could lead to the total extinction of human civilization. And now even now, we still face that prospect with the amount of nuclear weapons we have on the planet. You wouldn't get that with just normal bombs. And that just shows, even then, he recognized that the difference of nuclear warfare to conventional warfare was he saw that as the deciding factor as why Japan needed to surrender to prevent that kind of prospect of the total extinction of the human civilization, if not and I quote, the ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation.
right. And there are also additional quotes, also from the National World War II Museum archive. that I wanted to refer to again. Just secondary source accounts to the primary source that Chad just read off right there. Quote, why did the emperor decide to end the war? In his contemporary statements, he consistently cited three reasons. First, he had lost faith in Ketsu-go, referring to the long record of discrepancy between plans and performance. This statement delivered a crushing blow to the High Command's whole rationale to continue fighting. Second, the Emperor cited the increasing devastation of conventional and nuclear bombing. Third, he referred to the domestic situation, the burgeoning fear of internal revolt. He did not mention Soviet entry into the war. So, a very clear message indeed that, um, first of all, he does not have a lot of confidence in the army. We do, of course, like when talking about Operation Downfall, we want to talk about the potential casualties and death counts on both sides. But as far as successfully defending Japan, which is really what Hirohito's talking about here, he's not just talking about Japan giving their last shot, while eventually losing, but we gave it our a good try. No, he's talking about, I want the military to tell me that in this Ketsugo defensive operation, which the Allies, for their offensive operation, they called it Operation Downfall. He wanted them to guarantee that they could push them off the home islands. And he said that this was not going to happen because of a long record of discrepancy between plans and performance, a crushing blow. So the military being told by their divine emperor that he did not have confidence in them was, of course, again, a crushing blow because they they worship the emperor. Although his position is a lot more of a figurehead, like um, like Queen Elizabeth in Great Britain, although Japan at the time wasn't exactly a constitutional monarchy. But anyway, they really had they put Hirohito's voice and opinion very highly, and being told that they weren't going to perform in the way that he needed to was very um, it was humbling. And of course, he's talking about the domestic situation as well, fearing their people, which is another very big reason. The fact that Soviet entry into the war was not mentioned goes to show like the strength of the position of of the nuke in ending the war and therefore saving a lot of lives. Um, just deciding here if I think I should use these quotes. Until then, Chad, why don't you go on and continue expanding on the points that we already have laid out?
Sure. So as we just mentioned, the Emperor Hirohito's doubt in the army's even capability to successfully defend Japan was one of the reasons that he himself and those on the peace side of the government, like negotiations, why they decided to seek for peace, because they didn't trust the army, and as we previously said, that the threat of nuclear warfare and the atomic bomb was one that they would just were not ready to handle. And so one of the things that was brought up with this discrepancy between Emperor Hirohito and the army is the possibility of a conflict between these two. So you would wonder, we've seen in previous quotes and previous evidence that those in the army, in the navy, still had the will to fight. They still wanted to fight. They still think that they could win it out, or they think that they would be willing to sacrifice for the homeland, for the emperor, for their livelihoods. And so you see an army that still wants to fight, an army that has influence in the government, one that wants to continue to keep going and not to surrender at all costs, just like they hadn't in Okinawa and in previous battles in the Pacific theater. And so you would wonder, should a war, so the invasion go forward, should the as we said, the invasion happened, what would happen with this conflict between the government and the armed forces. We also mentioned there that the those in the government who were seeking for peace, they were worried about the populace, the civilians, whose situation was continuing to get worse. I mean, the United States had a naval blockade around Japan. Supplies, food would not be going in. Bombing raids were pretty constant, and so the United States was kind of draining their resources, and the people, at least to the concern of the government, could be starting to become unhappy. Maybe they would even revolt against the government, and especially if the government was to go forward and defend the island, given an invasion of the allies of the enemy. You might have on your hands a civil war, a war in which the army continues to fight against the allies and invading forces, as well as a government who is trying to seek for peace and trying to end for conflict. And then add upon that, they might even be fighting against a civilian populace who does not want this war to happen. And you might have even then a divided civilian populace between those who want to fight the Allies and defend their homeland and those who just want it to be over. And so right there, you just have chaos.
Right.
It's plain and simple.
Like it's hard to say exactly what exactly would be happening because there would be a lot of civilians that would be pressured into contributing with the fight. A lot of them may actually willingly take on the burden of fighting because they do not want their homeland to fall.
Hmm.
Um, because they've been told through imperial propaganda that an American victory or an Allied victory would result in the destruction of Japanese culture. So even if they were revolting against the government, in which they might actually be doing, as soon as they heard about Allied troops invading their country, if they found them on their street or in their town, then they would attack likely. So it's very hard to understand exactly what would be happening, but essentially there'd be chaos. If there was any decision that would lead to the most amount of deaths possible, it would be not dropping the bomb and going ahead for an invasion,
Hmm.
which was again the only other option for the Allies.
Yeah. I mean, like we said, the invasion itself, even if it's just a conventional US versus Japan, that would have been terrible. We already mentioned both here and in the last video that the US Army alone were expecting close to millions of casualties. And that's not even taking in the amount of Japanese soldiers, civilians, men, women, children, elderly, sick, all that kind of stuff who would be fighting and dying in that war. That's terrible enough. And now add in what could potentially be a divided conflict between those who may want to participate and may not to, which, as we said, is hard to predict. And all of this is hard to predict anyway because, of course, it didn't happen. But given the likelihood of divisions, one within the government and within, the armed forces and those seeking peace, and the potential divide within the civilians, if you thought the invasion itself, which is already terrible, if you thought that was bad, it may be even worse with this sort of divided, chaotic civil war, which could have happened should the invasion have gone through. And so, in that sort of case, all of that stuff would dwarf the casualties that we had in the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which of course were terrible. Hundreds of thousands of people died, and many thousands had lingering circumstances. But when you look between the choice of an invasion, waiting it out, which likely would not have worked, and dropping the bomb, there seems to be a pretty clear one which would have led to less deaths, and that would be the dropping of the atomic bombs.
Right. And it's not like there was only one bomb. By this point, if you've watched up until this point, you'll understand that there were two bombs that were dropped. But even up in that point, the Americans had more. They
Yeah.
had three on the way, ready to be dropped just in the month of August, if need be. And Truman did not want that third bomb to be dropped because of the humanitarian guilt that he was having.
He was very
Right.
distressed after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So I believe August 10th, he himself he decided that he did not. He paused the campaign that would have called for another bombing of, I can't recall what the next city targeted would have been.
I think it
Um,
was Kokuda. No, I don't remember the
yeah,
name.
and so he himself, he called for that halting of that because of that. But we had more on the way. There was another one that would have been ready August 19th, and then another one that would have been ready by the end of August, and then likely would have sped up and have another one by the end of August, should need be. And so this was, of course, this was not a one-off thing. We were ready. We were ready to make more, and we were just getting started, to be honest.
Right. And it was up until the 14th that Truman was really worried about that humanitarian guilt. On the 10th, he said he did not want to do any more. But by the 14th, he was coming around to the idea that to force a Japanese surrender and therefore save lives, he would have to drop another one. But then the day after, Hirohito essentially saved Japan from a third bomb by giving that public announcement of surrender. And um, as we are beginning to wrap up this argument, there are a couple things we want. There's just a couple things more we wanted to mention. That Japan was incredibly densely populated. The U.S. square mile size, as it was then, is not too much bigger than it is today. Um, it's around 3.65 million square miles, with a population of 140 million at the time. And the person per square mile was 38. So that is, if I got my math right, it's 38 people per square mile. And Japan, um, with a square mile size of only 146,000 with the home islands, um, which would be the islands that they would be defending in the case of an American invasion, of an Allied invasion, with a population at the time of 77 million throughout those home islands. The person per square mile figure would be 527. So Japan at the time was a lot smaller, but it was over half the population of US. And so they were 14 times almost more densely populated than the US. So you can imagine then that in such a densely populated area, on top of the fact that there were um, geographical limits, and then on top of the fact that there were millions of soldiers and civilians that were ready to fight, and that there were that it would involve an amphibious landing. It would be hard enough if they were connected to the continent. You look at the major population centers like Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kyoto, Yokohama, and Kobe, all the biggest cities at the time. Tokyo itself, the capital, which would be so crucial in taking in such an invasion, had 7 million population. Um, and Osaka 3.2, Nagoya 1.3, Kyoto 1.1, Yokohama 1 million, and Kobe almost 1 million. So today, for any of us watching in 2022, we hear a lot about the potential Russian conquest of Kiev. But then, of course, today, by this point, we found out that such a conquest, such an invasion of Kiev would be impossible because the city's just so big that the Russians would need much more troops to take a city that large. Um, and Kiev only had 2 million people, 3 million people. And during the war, like as the Russians were approaching, it was brought down to 1 million, and not all of them were combatants. But in such a case of an Allied invasion of Japan, so much of the Japanese population would be drafted into service. The fact is, a lot of the people that did die in the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bomb attacks probably would have been brought into military service in such an invasion. And so, with a population of 7 million alone, Tokyo, which is on the other side of a mountain range, that the Allies would probably have to cross. um, um, would need to enter that city and fight off 7 million people. Now, excluding babies and those that would simply be physically unable to fighting, you still have what could have been 4 to 5 million armed folks, that are willing to kill every single one of you. So how many allied soldiers would be needed just to take that one city? And then also listing the other population centers that had been listed so far. You know, like an invasion of Japan would be downright messy.
Hmm. We regard the Battle of Stalingrad, 1942, 1941, 1942, as the worst battle in human history. That was about 2 million casualties. The invasion of Japan, as we can't state it enough, would have been much, much worse than that. It's and so we come back to of course the main argument that we've been making. Were the atomic bombs justified? We see that it was a pretty clear contrast between dropping the atomic bombs, which as we saw led to the surrender of Japan, or the protractment of um, a sort of conflict that which would have been so much more devastating and honestly would have been a human tragedy had it occurred. And you get to ask yourself which choice would have saved more lives. And to us, it seems very obvious that while, as we said, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were devastating, it was a better, while bad choice. It was a better out of the bad choices that we had, um, a better one to save more lives. And um, let's see. Do you have
Right.
another quote you'd like to present?
Yeah, I mean, I had to choose between two. This one about how the Japanese like commanders in Korea and Japan um would not have listened to the emperor's orders. Um and actually, I'm not directly going to quote this one. I'm going to quote the other one that I was mentioning that you first saw right there. But this one's quite interesting because we already did talk about how like some in the military did not even want to listen to the emperor. The Soviet invasion was not enough. The blockade was not enough. Advancing through the Pacific was not enough. Bombing the country itself was not enough. Um, and the possibility of revolt, was worrying, but it's not what dissuaded the military officials, the civilian government officials. They considered that as being a reason why they should end the war soon, so that they could keep that revolt under wraps. But the military government, they kept on pushing. They
Hmm.
needed a reason to stop fighting. And even
We saw
when the
that we
emperor,
saw that even the atomic bombs was close to not being enough, which is how the army was so opposed and even just straight up denying the existence of them. Like that
right.
almost wasn't even enough.
Yeah, so um, we were talking about it as if the commanders, on the field would not surrender. Well, they didn't surrender. Okay, after two bombs were dropped, the city is like the entire home islands have been blockaded. Their people are starving, on the verge of revolt. The Soviets attacked. They have been beaten back and forth for the past 4 years at the very least, with 8 years of conflict beginning with China. And when the emperor, their god, tells them to stop fighting, they say no. It actually took a second address from the emperor himself to the armed forces specifically to say, you better stop fighting now. And then they finally stopped. But what I really want to quote here, and I mean, this will be the last quote, um, is that Prime Minister Suzuki at the time, 4 months later, after the war had ended, 3, 4 months after the war had ended, he had an interview where he admitted, something else. Quoting, the advent of atomic bombs showed the Americans no longer needed to invade Japan. If the Americans did not mount an invasion, Ketsugo was bankrupt, and the High Command has no strategy short of national suicide. So I think you just need to listen very carefully. And this lines up with the conclusion, Chad. So don't worry, we are approaching that hour and we're nearing the end of this argument. So I think we can finish this in under an hour. But we just need to really make sure we get the words right in this one. It's not that if the Americans would have invaded that they had a plan of national suicide. That's not it. No, it's not that like, oh, they would have invaded and therefore through defending it would be national suicide.
Yeah,
No.
not
It
even
was
going that far.
it no, yeah, exactly. It's we drop the bombs and we don't invade. If you don't surrender, this is a strategy like no strategy short of national suicide.
Yeah,
So we bomb them into oblivion with nukes. We nuke Tokyo, and still they don't surrender. What do you do then? Like we can't do anything if we're not going to invade. So and if we're not going to invade and we're continuing to do everything that we're doing, we're just waiting it out. Then the Japanese officials would have no plan other than to kill everyone in the home islands. Kill everyone, even if we didn't invade.
yeah, it's a
So,
mess. It would have been a mess. The
like,
whole
just really
situation was a
listen to this quote
mess.
here.
Yeah,
Like, if the Americans did not mount an invasion, Ketsugo was bankrupt, and the High Command has no strategy short of national suicide, genocide upon their own people.
through just letting them continuously be bombed and not giving up, because that's all they had left. That's all they would have been left with if they decided not to surrender. And as we saw, we got close to that. We got close to that, even with the dropping of the atomic bombs. We got close to them not even letting that be the reason. Like, that might not even have been it. But thankfully, those in the Japanese government came to the right decision that that surrender was the best way to save millions of Japanese lives. And we've seen how that turned out today. That it obviously was the right decision. Japan is a much more prosperous country. They've recovered so much more economically, and they still exist. They're not a nuclear wasteland. So obviously, it was the
They
right
haven't
choice.
killed their own people. They have not committed genocide upon their own people. If Japanese people still exist in this alternate scenario, they would not.
Yep,
Every single Japanese person on the homelands would have been killed by their own government by suicide or murder.
yep. So, as we said, they came up with the right decision, and hopefully, as you could see, as we've outlined in these past two videos, we've come
Very
to the
clearly.
conclusion very clearly that hopefully you have come to the conclusion as well that the atomic bombs were justified and that they led to the right decision within the Japanese government to surrender, which ultimately saved thousands, if not millions, of more lives. So, yeah, we're just about at the time. We hope you enjoyed this. We presented our point of view, our perspective, which has been influenced, of course, by research, our time in education, and of course, we're not professionals. I mean, but we're pretty. We hope to have given you the best.
I
um,
think we know quite a bit on this topic, but anyway, yeah.
yeah, as we said, this is our perspective. Um, yeah, this is our first kind of series of our special episodes, and we hope to start getting out more of them to you. We have many other topics, some of them covering the idea of nuclear war, nuclear weapons, that theory of deterrence. Another question we might look at is, um, ethno-nationalism and things related to liberalism and things like that. And then we also more philosophical questions like the trolley problem, or just looking at truth from a philosophical basis, somewhat similarly to what we did in our first series, but looking at it in a different way. So those are kind of some of the things you might expect going forward.
All right. And without a further ado, because we want to end this as soon as possible now, we're really hitting that hour mark. We might even be a little bit beyond it. Um, We want to know that we'll be back to you within another 3 days to post whether or not it'll be a special episode again or it'll be back on the main series on our discussion about how liberalism has the potential of leading to fascism if taken far enough. Um, um, but until then, like, subscribe, do all that. Bless the YouTube algorithm,
Bless
share
the
it to
algorithm.
people. Yeah, exactly. Bless the algorithm. Share it to anybody that you think might be interested, even someone that you think might not be interested. Share it to them too. Hack into their account, like it, subscribe, do all that. Bless the YouTube algorithm. All right. Without further ado, we are the Marshals of Truth. I'm Khalil.
I'm Jad.
All right.
Thank you for
And
watching.
goodbye.